Order, order. Thank you for joining us today. This is our third E-Petition session, which we've scheduled to give members from across the House an opportunity to discuss stamp duty land tax relief during the Covid-19 outbreak. Sessions like this would normally take place in Westminster Hall, but due to the suspension of sittings, we've started holding these sessions as an alternative way to consider the issues raised by petitions and present them to government. And I'm very pleased that holding today's session virtually means that members who are shielding or self-isolating and are therefore generally unable to take part in Westminster Hall to date are able to participate today. I'm also pleased that the official opposition has fielded a front bench speaker, that we have a minister to attend the session and respond to the points that members raise, as we would in Westminster Hall. So order, order, and I invite Elliot Colburn to open today's session.
Thank you very much, Chair. And to remind colleagues, today we're discussing E-Petition 550545, entitled Extend the Stamp Duty Holiday for an Additional 6 months after the 31st of March 2021. To begin with the prayer of this petition, it states, and I quote, that extending the stamp duty holiday for an additional 6 months will assist many buyers who are looking to move to a property that they will not be able to afford otherwise. This will help stabilise the housing market. I am looking to move into a new build which will currently have to complete by the start of March 2021. However, if the build is delayed past this date, I will not be able to afford the stamp duty and ultimately not be able to afford the house. To date, around 138,000 people have signed this petition, including 413 people from my own Cashel and Wallington constituency. And before continuing, I'd like to also note the huge interest that there has been in this petition. During my time in the Petitions Committee, I don't think I've had so many emails or phone calls from either affected petitioners, the press, or indeed colleagues before we've come to this discussion. So it's a shame that we couldn't have it a bit more formally, but I think it's important that we got this petition in before the 31st of March deadline, so that the Minister, who's kindly come along today to hear this debate, has a chance to hear our concerns and respond. Now, there is a temptation, I'll admit, to want to talk about the merits or otherwise of stamp duty as a tax as a whole. Indeed, I do question whether or not this tax should or does have a future, given that it often acts as a barrier to home ownership, as people scrimp and save for a deposit, only to be met with thousands more pounds worth of stamp duty to pay, and consequently could delay getting their first fit on the property ladder. However, I appreciate that we are in a time of pandemic and that the Treasury will want to ensure that its budget can see us past this pandemic. So it may not be looking at a total restructure of the tax system more broadly right now, so I will keep to the specifics of the asks in the petition. The stamp duty holiday was enormously welcome and helped to keep fluidity in the housing market even during the pandemic. Indeed, many who have contacted me have spoken of an influx of buyers and sellers as a direct result of the stamp duty holiday. Now, we don't have the data and we cannot be absolutely sure of the effect that the stamp duty holiday has had on the market, but we do have strong indicators to suggest that it has indeed led to something of a boom. HMRC published its most recent data on monthly property transactions on the 21st of January, and the headline statistic from those was that the provisionally seasonally adjusted estimate of UK residential transactions in December 2020 was 129,400. Nearly 32% higher than that time last year. The Financial Times also reported on the 4th of December, and I quote, that the UK housing boom continued to bolster the construction sector in November despite the autumn's double-dip economic downturn, with builders reporting the fastest expansion of orders in more than 6 years. Now, of course, not all of this will solely come down to the tax holiday, but an educated guess would certainly indicate that this has helped contribute at least to confidence in the market. However, this has had a number of consequences and led to a situation where many, like those petitioners, could face out on losing on this holiday and face a hefty tax bill that they cannot afford at the end because their sales will not complete by the 31st of March. Indeed, Mr. Steele, who started this petition, tells me that he is looking at a £12,000 liability for stamp duty if this sale does not complete. This is unaffordable for him, and the sale will ultimately fall through if it is not completed. Now, the assertion has been supported by many lenders, solicitors and estate agents who have been in touch with me, and I'm sure many colleagues as well, since we announced that this debate was taking place. that due to the unprecedented demand on their services to complete transactions by the 31st of March deadline, they are unable to keep up with demand, keep up with the pressure, and will ultimately mean that many will miss out. Indeed, one lender, Paragon, did share some really alarming statistics with me. They agreed that many prospective buyers had budgeted on the basis that they will be able to take advantage of this tax break. But Paragon's data from its customer survey that it recently showed of those in the mortgage pipeline showed that almost 2/3 of customers are dependent or have another buyer dependent somewhere else in the chain who are dependent on completion by the current deadline. The customers surveyed represent a property transaction total of nearly £1.5 billion. If prospective buyers who are dependent on completion by the 31st of March deadline find themselves unable to do so, the result will inevitably be an unprecedented volume of demand for withdrawals, disrupting chains and the wider residential purchase market on a massive scale. Again, going back to Paragon's data that they shared with me, they suggest that 51% of cases could collapse if the March deadline isn't met. However, the wider effect on the market is likely to be much higher than that, as each individual case has the potential to have a knock-on effect to others throughout the chain. Even more concerning, 42% said that they would unlikely to be able to continue with the purchase of the property at all if they couldn't take advantage of the stamp duty holiday. And this rises to nearly half when we look at those who are personally dependent on completion. So the impact on the market clearly could be substantial. But there's finally an element of fairness, I think, in all of this, with prospective buyers beginning their house buying journey in good faith, budgeting for this tax break, who could no longer qualify through essentially no fault of their own. Consequently, I would agree that with the petitioners and urge the government to look to extend the stamp duty holiday. And there are many ways the government could do this. It could reset the deadline to a new arbitrary date. It could explore the possibility of allowing transactions that begin before the 31st of March to be eligible only. It could set a new date and begin to taper off the relief by eligibility of house price each month. It could maintain the stamp duty threshold of £500,000 permanently, which is something that the Taxpayers Alliance, for example, have called for. However, if a permanent change to stamp duty isn't on the Treasury's outlook, especially during a time of pandemic, then I would argue that a phased and tapered winding down of the relief would probably be the most preferable option. This would help the market not suffer any overnight shocks like the one that it could incur on the 31st of March if the relief isn't extended. But I hope colleagues who are taking part in today's debate will expand a bit more about what they believe their solution should be. Finally, I'm grateful that the Minister has given time to come along and respond to this debate, given that it's not in a formal debate chamber this afternoon. And he is forgiven in advance for, I'm sure, what he will say about waiting for the budget and market sensitivities. But I do hope that we can persuade the government today to take this further with the Chancellor and deliver some good news for those homeowners at the budget. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Elliot. We now go to Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Ms McKennell, and could I also thank the member for Carshalton and Wellington for introducing in such a measured way some of the wider parameters around this debate. And I tend to agree that right now might not be a good moment to start completely changing the whole way that we look at tax and spend. And he quite rightly says that tapering off or looking at an approach around the edges is probably best. I note, for example, that the Welsh Government has looked at certain beneficiaries of this stamp duty holiday, for example, second homeowners, who perhaps were a bit cheeky because this is mainly designed to help people onto the housing ladder. As we know, our problem is in the wider sense of housing, trying to help people onto any housing ladder whatsoever, or indeed for some people, even getting them into secure housing in the way of social homes due to the lack of social homes. And of course, that speaks to the point around the lack of revenue to the HMRC, which could be used for more social homes or to assist in other house building activities, which we know as constituency MPs matter so much. So this does need to be looked at in the round. The other point I would make is the nature of the times that we live in. We, of course, are in a period of in extremis, a very difficult period, and so on, which means that we have got a number of different considerations. One of those being, in normal times, moving house is considered to be the second most stressful activity after getting a divorce. And we should be thinking carefully about how our constituents are managing these big changes to their lives. Many people have decided to up sticks and move completely, and we need to be thoughtful in policy terms in how we respond to those big life changes. I also briefly wanted to talk about some of the concerns which were raised by my constituents. Obviously, I have received a number of emails, being in a part of the capital, which has a buoyant housing market. And dozens of my constituents have contacted me who believe they were going to benefit from this stamp duty holiday, but now face costs they can't afford and the very real possibility of their sales falling through. The government needs to accept this and follow the Welsh Labour government in saving those buying houses with targeted economic support. And that really is the ask coming directly from my constituents. I would just add that the wider economic benefits of a buoyant housing market are that the construction industry has a sort of a continual flow through and confidence. And secondly, there is a knock-on effect in terms of retail, of keeping going some of our furniture suppliers, some of our cabinet makers, and all the other people who benefit when people move house. So in conclusion, Ms McKinnell, I would like to put on record the concerns of my constituents around the tapering off or the finishing up of this scheme at the end of next month. I do hope that in the budget the Chancellor will acknowledge the stress and the inconvenience of this scheme coming to an end, and that the stress and worry of those moving house and who may not benefited from what they had hoped in terms of a stamp duty holiday will be recognised by the Treasury. And I look forward to hearing the Treasury Minister respond at the end of this debate. And just winding up again in terms of the flexibility we've seen by the Welsh Government looking at, there were certain categories within this, for example, second home homeowners who were selling on and using this as an opportunistic moment, that they're in quite a different category from some people who are seeking to, for example, buy for the first time, or, for example, who for family reasons or reasons related to coronavirus, bereavements, childcare, and all those family reasons did have to move. So I do hope that the Treasury Minister will give us what he can in advance of the budget in terms of those people who are in desperate worry around this situation. Thank you, Ms McKinnell.
Thank you. We now go to Kevin Hollerake.
Thank you, Ms McKinnell, for hosting this very important debate, and for my and to my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wellington. I thought he set out the case for both sides extremely well, but and certainly for his constituents. But I certainly, of the options he suggested, a simple, what we are doing, we are approaching a cliff edge. That's the reality. And simply extending this further would create another cliff edge. If you said, OK, give this another 3 months, there'd be another cliff edge, and similar people would be saying similar things. So one of his options was, I believe, that we simply allow some of those who are at a sufficiently advanced stage, for example, they've got a mortgage offer by, say, the end of February, more time to complete their sale. I think that's the fairest and simplest way to resolve this problem. And there is a problem. It's quite an unusual problem because of the circumstances around COVID. I should draw the debate's attention to my registry member's interest, Ms McKinnell. I have been through 3 recessions in my business in the property sector that involve stamp duty concessions. And I think this is probably the 3rd or 4th time we've seen a stamp duty concession to stimulate the economy. It's certainly a good idea. The first one I remember was back in 1992, and the market was pretty tough back then. But each of them has ended in a cliff edge, which has caused this hiatus, lots of sales going through before that date, lots of people disappointed afterwards and sales falling through after that date, which has a counterproductive economic effect. I mean, the reality with this is, I think this is more about an issue relating to other elements of the supply chain within the housing sector rather than just the market itself. We did see quite a strong market was in place already at the point in time the stamp duty concession was brought in. So I did welcome it at the time, but I think it went on too much longer. I think potentially in a way that where there was going to be some kind of cliff edge coming back in, you could create a bubble effect, and that it wouldn't be helpful. It would result in some people buying, being too desperate to buy, pushing up prices, and then prices falling afterwards. Nobody wants to see that. And I think the statistic that my honourable friend pointed out, a 32% increase in the number of transactions in terms of from HMRC, is pretty compelling. That could be the case unless this particular concession ends at some point. I do think there is a very, very valid case for reform. Stamp duty is a transactional tax. That's a deterrent to economic activity. That cannot be a good thing. But I think that needs to be seen in the full context of proper reform of property taxes, looking at council tax and lots of other things. Personally, I favour a proportional property tax that would abolish stamp duty and just change the way we tax properties, which would be beneficial for the economy. And that said, not just the economy around the housing market, house builders and the like, and estate agents, but also the knock-on effect into lots of other sectors, the sale of white goods, SME house builders, lots of things people benefit from housing market activity. The reality is we've got a huge logjam in the market because of COVID, because of the lack of capacity in the conveyancing sector and the mortgage sector, some of which is caused by COVID or has been made worse because of COVID. So I think we've got around 490,000 properties currently sat in this pipeline, hoping to go through by the end of March, and lots of people are going to be disappointed. So, as I say, if I can conclude, Ms McKinnell, my ask for the Minister, this was a good policy, a good concession at the time, because of this logjam that we're going to see, is to extend for some people, say people who have been got a mortgage offer by the end of February, give them 3 more months to complete their sale or to exchange contracts beyond the end of March. To me, I think that would be a sensible compromise that would alleviate some unfairnesses in this concession.
Thank you. We now go to Diane Abbott. You need to unmute, Diane.
Thank you very much, Chair, for calling me in this important debate. I want to speak about a very specific constituency matter. I am calling for a very specific extension to the stamp duty holiday for the people of Hackney because of a particular disaster that has happened in Hackney. On Sunday, the 11th of October, Hackney Council suffered a very serious cyber attack which impacted very many systems as well as backup data. This attack's not the fault of the council, it is the council services, and above all, Hackney residents who are the victims here. One of the many impacted services has been the council's planning department. Because of the cyber attack, council workers and others cannot access the main databases and systems they need to complete local land searches. They can't access the local land register and other records such as building control certificates. And as honourable and right honourable colleagues will know, many of these searches are deemed necessary by mortgage lenders to complete a sale. The council has worked hard to put some mitigations in place to offer partial land searches, but the council is not going to be in a position to offer full local land searches as required by many mortgage providers at this time. This means that people looking to buy in Hackney have been unable to take advantage of the stamp duty holiday announced by the government. As many of you will know, selling or buying a property can be extremely stressful at the best of times. With this hurdle in the way, the stress levels can only be imagined. We have had so many Hackney households contact my office, and the council has had many more worried residents in contact with them. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. Lives are being blighted by the inability to buy or sell homes in Hackney. One would-be buyer, Jessica, told the BBC, "It's extremely frustrating as the hack has ruined our plans and cost us money we'll never get back. The sale of our property fell through because our buyer wasn't able to carry out a search on a house, so they couldn't get a mortgage. Subsequently, we lost the house we were planning on buying and had already spent more than £1,000 on a survey for." That's just one example of the very many examples that I have heard and seen about the effect of this cyber attack on Hackney, and in particular, its effect on the ability of Hackney residents to get their land searches done. My simple ask today is this: when these issues are resolved, which we hope they will be soon, the residents of Hackney should be allowed to enjoy the same benefits as others have through the stamp duty holiday. Special allowances should be made and a grace period announced so that Hackney residents buying or selling homes can enjoy the financial advantage that the rest of the country has already enjoyed. There'll be no fiscal consequences beyond that the Treasury has always accounted for. So, in the interests of equity and fairness, and to acknowledge the disaster of the cyber attack, I simply ask that Hackney residents should be given their own stamp duty holiday extension at the appropriate time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We now go to Greg Smith.
Thank you, Ms McKinnell. Like many honourable and right honourable members, I've received a huge volume of correspondence on the stamp duty holiday from estate agents and from potential buyers, first-time buyers and those looking to down or upsize alike. And 418 of my constituents have signed the petition we debate today. Now, from the outset and for total transparency, I should add that owing to the happy news that my wife is expecting our third child, my family, we are looking to move to something a little bit bigger at the moment ourselves. But from the outset, I want to talk about this from a national perspective. And I absolutely welcomed the Chancellor's stamp duty holiday and believe it has proven successful in attracting both buyers and sellers to the property market at what is, as I'm sure we will all agree, an incredibly difficult time for our economy. However, the property market is now facing a cliff edge with the holiday ending on the 31st of March. And this will have a devastating impact on the residential property market, with it likely to stall at a time when it really should be at its busiest. Now, in my constituency, some modelling has been done by the property research firm 20CI, and they found that 231 families that agreed a sale in December last year will miss out on the stamp duty saving, with this number continuing to grow through the first few months of 2021. If these movers do fully pull out of transactions, this will result in nearly £9 million being lost in spending in the home moving market on services such as conveyancers, estate agents' fees, despite significant work having already taken place. And nearly £1 million will be lost, and this is just for the Buckingham constituency alone, nearly £1 million lost in the wider home mover spending in the economy on decorators, furnishings, renovations, other high street and retail businesses. Nationally, there's the worst case scenario that due to the high volumes and capacity challenges, 200,000 movers are likely to miss the stamp duty deadline. And already estate agents in my constituency, like Russell and Butler, are informing me sales are falling through in expectation of the deadline. So the holiday has created a degree of urgency in the market, with many home buyers and sellers struggling to get their deals across the line before the end of March. Local authority searches are taking longer than usual, as are mortgage approvals, leading to weeks in delays. And those at the greatest risk of pulling out are hardworking families on low and middle incomes that simply can't afford an extra bill in the thousands of pounds. So extending the stamp duty holiday will protect businesses in the wider economy that are reliant on home mover spending, but also ensure that that dream of home ownership can come true for so many others. Now, I appreciate that with the huge scale borrowing that has been rightly required to fund the COVID support schemes, the government needs to generate revenues now more than ever. But the property market and the wider economy does remain fragile. And I appreciate there'll be those who argue that there's not the fiscal headroom, but it's always been my view that the best way to raise revenue is to stimulate the economy through tax cuts, not shut down opportunities through tax rises. And nowhere is this more apparent than with the stamp duty land tax, a tax that at its very core is a tax on aspiration, a tax on the dream of home ownership, and a tax that disincentivizes movement in the property market, pinning millions already on the ladder into homes that aren't necessarily right for them today. So my first argument would be a serious overhaul of this tax. A 2019 paper by the Centre for Policy Studies argued that taking an average of various economic studies, each 1% fall in stamp duty would increase housing transactions by approximately 20%, and abolishing it altogether would increase transactions by a quarter. Considerable benefits for our wider economy, as well as the Treasury. But in the short term, too many people are already along the path to moving and are being caught out. It's essential the government steps in to make this holiday count for those movers already engaged in transactions, but for whom delays may push them past the 31st of March. So let's keep the housing market and the thousands of businesses and jobs that depend on it moving, and support all our constituents wanting to move to be able to do so without hindrance.
Thank you. I now call Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Chair McKinnell. It's a pleasure to take part in this virtual petition debate, and we know that petition debates give us an indicator of what the public priorities are, and in this case it's about stamp duty land relief. As stated in the petition itself, government decided to introduce a temporary stamp duty land tax relief. This relief increased the starting threshold of residential SDLT from 125,000 to 500,000 from the 8th of July 2020 until the 31st of March 2021. Since the relief was introduced, transactions have increased, and seasonally adjusted data shows in October 2020 transactions were 8% higher than in October 2019. This is positive for our economy, especially as so many sectors is under financial pressure due to the impact of the virus. Stamp duty relief makes the prospect of home ownership for the first-time buyers and for those moving home a bit more of a reality for many people, couples, and indeed families. Buying a property, as we well know, is by no means cheap, but the relief help when it comes to buying a property is very much welcomed. Stamp duty relief doesn't just help first-time buyers. I know residents who have found themselves in financial hardship due to coronavirus and debts they have incurred, and they've needed to downsize. In this economy, they should not be put into further difficulty for making these difficult decisions arising from the pandemic. The announcement of the relief of stamp duty until March 2021 was most welcomed last year. However, we know that sadly the virus has not been confined to that financial year, and the issues that which were around then are still around now. Madam Chair McKinnell, just as we've seen the extension of the job retention scheme, the emphasis on working from home and other public health measures continue beyond March, so too should be the stamp duty relief. We have seen no indication of the economic need for this measure to change. Indeed, we are deeper into the pandemic now than we were last spring in terms of the cost of human life. The extension of stamp duty relief would benefit all of us, regardless of whether we ourselves are wanting to buy a property or move home, but we all need the economy to move again, and where it is moving, we need this to continue. Moving home also benefits connected services. If the property market dwindles, there are fewer people paying for surveyors, architects, engineers, estate agents, removal companies, fewer people buying boxes to move home, buying furniture or hiring all types of people that are needed to make a home pleasurable for when they're moving into it. That means businesses failing and staff being laid off. The property market is one of the key indicators of our country's financial success. So when more people are encouraged to buy, we all feel the knock-on benefit. If there are incentives for people to buy, all these businesses will prosper and a broader economic upturn will be seen. The government must commit to renewing the stamp duty relief because this economy's need is far from over.
Thank you. We now go to Dr. Matthew Offord. And you need to unmute.
It's a great pleasure to contribute to this debate this afternoon. The stamp duty holiday was introduced by the Chancellor last summer, and it has undoubtedly given the housing market a much needed boost at a critical time. Thousands of young people, including many in my constituency of Hendon, have been helped onto the property ladder. But in addition, older people have been helped to downsize, freeing up family homes for the next generations to move into. It's been estimated that by extending the holiday until the end of the year would increase transactions by around 10%, boosting productivity and creating much needed employment. Polling by the Homes for Later Living Consortium show around 3 million older people want to downsize into suitable retirement properties. The extension of the stamp duty holiday would help facilitate this, and the chain impact will be a major boost for first-time buyers. Furthermore, according to the House Builders Federation, for every 100,000 housing transactions, there is an additional £1 billion in gross value added, and that this in turn supports more than 11,500 jobs, either directly or indirectly. I recognise that what the government gives with one hand, it must take up with the other. But a number of my constituents have told me that they will not be able to go ahead with their property purchases if they cannot complete before the 31st of March of this year. With much of the economy currently closed and a prospect of a protracted recovery, I urge the government not to close the door on the housing market and the associated industries, but at the very moment we need them to thrive, I ask them to reconsider. My contribution has been short today, but I can assure you that the issue is one that is very important to my constituents. As we know, in another part of the House today, there is a discussion about cladding. These two issues may not be directly linked, but it is an overall indication of problems facing the housing market. And this is something that the Chancellor can do in his budget in March, and I urge him to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And now go to Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Ms McKinnell, thanks. I want to thank the Petitions Committee for putting on this important debate at a time when the government has not extended the support needed to run Westminster Hall debates virtually, and I hope they will think to do that in future. This is a vital topic for thousands of families across the country. The decision to implement the stamp duty holiday was an important measure to support the housing industry throughout what has been, we all know, a very difficult time for many people during the pandemic. But I'm now being contacted by constituents concerned that the end of the stamp duty holiday on March the 31st is going to cause their planned house purchase to fall through, potentially leaving them facing thousands of pounds of legal fees with nothing to show for it. And this is particularly concerning as the current lockdown is causing many aspects of the house buying process to slow down. Whether it's carrying out surveys or completing a local authority search, delays risk pushing exchange and completion for many people to the other side of the March 31st deadline. Now, over summer and autumn, people made important decisions on buying a property, thinking they would be able to complete during the stamp duty holiday.
Back then, none of us could predict what lay ahead in terms of further lockdowns and restrictions. We are back in lockdown, and now many people suddenly face the possibility of owing thousands of pounds of stamp duty, which they cannot afford. And this will disrupt, change and damage confidence in our housing market. I've heard from one constituent who chose to move because of the stamp duty holiday, doing exactly what the government wanted people to do. They sold their house, moved into rented accommodation and exchanged on a new home. But because of the current lockdown, their completion date has now been pushed back to May. Unless the stamp duty holiday is extended, they will face a bill running to £7,500, which they simply do not have. And that's unacceptable. Nobody should be penalised in this way, potentially causing them long-term financial difficulties. Particularly not when people can minimise social mixing and slow the spread of the virus if their move is delayed until after this lockdown. I'm calling on the government to act to ensure that people who have made a commitment to buy a house in the reasonable expectation that they wouldn't have to pay stamp duty are not hit with an excess charge. And as we have heard, there are options. This need not be an open-ended extension to the duty holiday, but could be retrospective to allow anyone who has already had an offer accepted to be exempt from stamp duty, even if they are unable to complete by March 31st. This would provide certainty to thousands of people who are currently purchasing properties, but who may be unable to complete this financial year through no fault of their own. And it would also mean that estate agents and solicitors are under less pressure to complete quickly, meaning fewer people forced to travel into their offices at the height of lockdown, putting their own and other people's health at risk. By granting this extension, government can provide reassurance to house buyers and help slow the spread of Covid-19 by deferring moves until the worst of this wave is over. Failing to act would mean letting down tens of thousands of people. I urge the government to be decisive and take action now, rather than letting this current uncertainty drag on.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the member for Carshalton and Wallington for opening this debate. And can I offer my congratulations to the member for Buckingham and his wife on their happy news of their imminent arrival. I was one of very few opposition backbench MPs who spoke against this measure when it was first introduced to the Commons in July, and I remain quite surprised that other opposition parties are not more vocal about what is effectively a massive tax giveaway to the wealthy in preference to many of the other spending priorities that were and continue to be overlooked. Just to repeat what I said on that occasion, I moved house in February 2020 to a new family home in my constituency. And since Richmond Park enjoys the 6th highest average house price of all UK constituencies, my stamp duty bill as a result of that move was quite considerable. So in speaking out against any further stamp duty holiday, therefore, I just want to reassure House I'm not motivated by sour grapes missing out on the tax break. And while I can understand that some of my own constituents, or indeed aspiring constituents, might be dismayed that I wish to see an end to this tax break that they were hoping to make use of, I'm not asking them to do something that I haven't very recently done myself. My own experience has reinforced the view I already had and share with the member for Carshalton and Wallington and others in this debate that stamp duty land tax is a regressive and poorly designed tax, falling as it does on the buyer and not the seller. But the question today is whether the Treasury, at this critical and unprecedented time in our country's economic history, is best advised to continue supporting house buyers or to use the money for other purposes. There's no doubt we're talking about a great deal of money. It's estimated that the cost of the stamp duty holiday will cost the Treasury £3.8 billion. We've got used to talking about phenomenal sums of money in relation to government support for vulnerable economic sectors and individuals during this crisis, but that shouldn't disguise the fact that £3.8 billion is an enormous amount. I argued back in July that this money could be better spent, and particularly for those who've been left out of other plans for economic support during the pandemic. So I know that the Treasury will have some very challenging decisions to make when it comes to announce the budget. There are calls for more support for low-income families through keeping the £20 uplift to universal credit, greater provision of free school meals. And I also I welcome the furlough scheme and other measures to keep household incomes maintained during this crisis. And I would like to see these continued for as long as they are needed. There's an urgent need to address the mental health crisis that threatens to engulf our society at all levels, from the frontline workers who've suffered the trauma of witnessing the thousands of excess deaths, to the school children who've endured the social isolation during their enforced absence from school. I'm particularly concerned about our town centre businesses, our shops, our restaurants, our beauty salons that have suffered a huge blow to their trading during 2020 and the early part of 2021. And there's an urgent need to provide them with support if they are to revive to serve our communities in the future. So I would urge the Treasury to consider measures to assist these businesses, including relief for deferred VAT payments or continued rates holidays. And of course, there's a compelling case to be made for pay rises across the public sector and for all those other frontline workers who've given so much to this country over the last year. But if the Treasury want to continue to support the housing market, there's a much more pressing call on public funds. The Opposition Day debate that's currently going on elsewhere in this digital place about the cladding scandal. We all know from our own casework the personal impact that the failure to remediate flammable cladding is having on thousands of our constituents and the extremely urgent need to address this. So I add my voice to the calls of many colleagues in the main chamber debate that the government must provide more funding to support leaseholders trapped in this nightmare. But the point I want to make here is to think about the impact that these unresolved cladding issues are having on the housing market. There are many, many flats that are now unsellable, thousands of families that cannot move. A far better way to support the housing market and unblock some of these issues is to properly fund the remediation of flammable cladding for all buildings. I take the point that a stamp duty holiday can have an impact on industries beyond the housing market, although you can see from the broken blind behind my right shoulder that a new house purchase doesn't always lead immediately to spending on fixtures and fittings. The member for Carshalton and Wallington highlighted in his opening speech the benefit that the stamp duty holiday has had on the construction industry. I'm very pleased that workers in these industries have been able to continue to work and earn during this difficult time, but I would argue that to continue to boost this industry at the expense of those being forcibly closed would be unjust. I hear the argument there are many buyers that have commenced the house buying purchase in the expectation that stamp duty holiday will apply to their purchase and may now be facing delays. And I would urge the Treasury to make allowances for transactions which have already commenced. But to commence a stamp duty holiday just to avoid a cliff edge would deprive the Treasury of much needed funds at a time when there are many extremely pressing calls upon our public finances. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we now go to Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve on this committee on this important topic. And I thank in particular the member for Carshalton and Wallington for bringing first this petition, but also for the balanced way in which he introduced the subject. Because as we've heard from the variety of speakers that have contributed to this important debate, it is quite complicated. And there's as the previous speaker highlighted, there's a lot of money that rides on this, both in terms of the economic value for the transaction and wider economic activity, but also in that cold, hard cash that the Treasury so definitely needs at the moment. So I was intrigued to listen to some of the counter views that we've heard this afternoon. One of the things that I think I do agree with wholeheartedly is my friend from Carshalton and Wallington when he said that whatever happens, the approach needs to be phased and tapered. And that's purely because we all agree, I think, on the fact that there is a cliff edge. There is a cliff edge when this holiday ends, and specifically when the stamp duty holiday ends in relation to all of the other stimuli and support measures that have been put in place by the government to get us through this stage of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, I note that the Minister for the Treasury is on the line and will be responding to this. And we can't, of course, preempt the budget in March, but some kind of tapering and phasing must surely be in order, just to prevent that cliff edge of everything happening at once, in particular with furlough hitting people as they seek to move. So I believe that the stamp duty holiday was the right measure to be brought in the summer. It was the right measure at the right time. It got the housing market moving. It created that additional economic activity that was just so vital at the time. Who knew? Fiscal stimuli works. That's great. And I'd ask the Chancellor, I think, to consider the merits of a short extension of that stamp duty holiday until we're through the most acute phase of this crisis. I know it will be warmly welcomed by movers, by the sector, and of course, by all the other aspects of the market. I'm talking in particular, as previous speakers have, about those services such as conveyancers, searchers, estate agents, and the decorators, the furnishers, the renovations, all those high street retail businesses. My honourable friend from Buckingham noted that the 20 CI data for his constituency showed how acute that the loss of spending power would be. And indeed, in my own constituency, the same data shows that it's in the same ballpark, £8.6 million of lost spending on home moving and 900 million on lost on the wider home income spending of those things that we discussed earlier. So this really is quite an important thing to get right, but it is not as simple as simply extending a holiday in perpetuum, because as we know, this is not a revenue neutral holiday. So the Treasury does lose money every time we keep this open, and we must have our eyes open to that. At this critical point in our nation's finances, our Treasury does need additional funding coming into the coffers. And even with all that additional activity generated by the moves that are in the system that have been brought forward and that are happening because of the holiday, we still lose money. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to look at the stamp duty land tax within the round of the wider taxation system, and noting, of course, what my honourable friend from Hornsey and Wood Green said about this in the middle of a pandemic is not the time to look at the large system of tax and spend in general. We do need to have a plan. We need to have an exit strategy from stamp duty land tax, because it is a dangerous and damaging tax in so many ways, disincentivizing economic activity. It is a brake on social mobility. So let's think about this in the long term. How do we replace this tax? And what wider taxation do we need to look at? I think the proportional property tax could be part of the solution, but you can't change one for one. It's not like for like. So we need to look at how tax is raised locally, and what powers local government has, and what the role of local government has in that taxation system.
Thank you. And we now call Labour's front bench to respond. Abena Aponasau.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to contribute on behalf of the opposition to today's debate on this important position. I also like to thank the Honourable Member for Castleton and Wellington for bringing forward this petition. He highlighted some of the challenges constituents are facing, which has been echoed from across the country. I just wanted to say we've been discussing in July last year that the government decided to raise the starting threshold of the residential stamp duty land tax from 125,000 to 500,000 between the 8th of July 2020 and the 31st of July this year. Today we've heard from honourable members across the House as they've clearly set out their constituents' views and their policies. The Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green talked about how dozens of constituents were going to benefit, but they're now going to meet the knock-end effect, and that the tapering end of this scheme would add a lot of stress to quite a number of her constituents. The Honourable Member for Hackney and Stoke Newington talked about cyber attacks on council services, which has impacted services in the planning department, which means because of this, the council can't complete land searches, which is deemed necessary for mortgage providers. The Honourable Member for Lewisham talked about incentives for people to buy, and the Honourable Member for Wolsey and Eccles South talked about constituents choosing to move because of the stamp duty incentive are now facing extra costs. At the time of this policy being announced, my honourable friend, the member for Bristol West, the Shadow Secretary for State for Housing, set out concerns about the design. My honourable friend criticised the government for allowing a large proportion of the financial support offered through this policy, an estimated 1.3 billion to go to those buying second homes, including holiday homes and buy-to-let properties, rather than being targeted at those that need it, which is something that Labour-run Wales has been focusing on, targeting those that do need it. In response to this petition, the government acknowledges that the SDLT is an important source of government revenue, raising several £billions each year to help pay for essential services the government provides. Even the Minister must therefore recognise that the design of this policy represents an unnecessary subsidiary for second homeowners. Now that the relief has been introduced, by this policy, it is set to end in 2 months, which is another flaw of its design is becoming ever clearer. As the person who created this petition sets out the petition text, the end date of this policy presents a looming cliff edge for people across the country who face difficulty by completing their purchase by the end of March. As the petitioner explains, they've been planning to complete their home purchases at the start of March, which will enable them to benefit from the relief. If, however, this completion is delayed, in their case, because of construction delays on their new build homes, they would face an increase and unaffordable stamp duty bill, meaning their sale would fall through, which is something that has been mentioned by a number of colleagues throughout this debate, particularly the Honourable Member for Hackney and Stoke Newington, talking about the impact in the council, the cyber attack. The problem is not one that only affects prospective buyers of new build homes. As anyone who has ever bought a home will know well, there are a whole range of reasons why completion can be delayed. It's an attempt to quantify the effect of the end of the relief that could have. 4 leading businesses in the residential property sector, Landmark Information Group, Purple Bricks, Simplify and the Mortgage Advice Bureau produce modelling which suggests that up to 200,000 home buyers risk not having their transactions completed in time, and so will miss out on the savings they expect to benefit from it. These 4 businesses explain that as of March 2020, it took an average of 6 months to complete a transaction, from registration with an agent to completion. This length of time is likely to have lengthened during COVID, as it would take longer to complete any physical parts of the overall buying process. With the relief lasting less than 9 months in total, we therefore have a perverse situation that much of the benefit could have gone to people whose home purchases were already underway when the outbreak hit, whilst many who begun home hunting on the promise of the relief will miss out. Unfortunately, I have to be honest with you, this seems to be yet another example of the Chancellor's short-term stop-start approach throughout the crisis. The stamp duty relief stoked the housing market, which already has bent up demand from the first COVID lockdown, causing demand for home buying services to far outstrip the market's capacity. The overheating now looks set to be followed by a crash of many people's sales. If people cannot complete their purchase before the relief time's out, they will face an extra charge of up to $15,000, which for many people will suddenly make their plans unavoidable. This scheme has left hundreds of thousands of homeowners potentially in a position of either proceeding with the purchase they cannot afford or abandon it and foregoing all the money they have spent in fees so far, not to mention the emotional stress of seeing their purchase slip through their fingers, which has been mentioned by a number of honourable members in this debate. While simply extending the current scheme will be welcomed by some, we would have concerns that this will create another cliff edge further down the line and would see more money spent on a scheme whose design we believe includes fundamental flaws. So can the Minister answer a direct question today, what he would say to those people who started to build a home they can only afford on the basis of the stamp duty relief, but will fail to complete by the end of March? This is the question at the heart of this petition and of the unfairness that many people feel. The government has a responsibility to give them a straight answer, and I look forward to the Ministers to doing so in his response. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I now call on the Minister to give the government's response.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. And may I congratulate you on this great e-debate innovation, which I think is a very creative solution to one of the problems that we have been facing in Parliament as a result of the COVID pandemic crisis we all are experiencing. And let me also, if I may, be the first, I think, in this debate to acknowledge the more than 100,000 people who have signed the petition that has triggered our discussion today. I want to pay tribute to them, and of course they flag and highlight the importance of the issue to many people across the UK. I should also thank my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for opening the debate, and I thank all other honourable members for their contributions and insights. As you will know, Madam Chair, there is a strong feeling on this issue, and the government and I, as the Minister responsible for tax policy, as Financial Secretary, are aware of the strength of feeling on this issue. I think it's been highlighted already that buying a house is one of the most stressful things that any of us can do in our lifetimes. It has uncertainties of its own at the best of times, and of course, I fully understand the frustrations of those who are, as we speak, in the process of purchasing a property, perhaps as part of a chain, and who may be concerned at the delays that they face. Many thousands of people, of course, work in the sector, including as conveyancers and surveyors, and before I address the topic and some of the questions that have been raised, I also think it's important to take the opportunity to thank them for their efforts. In challenging circumstances, they've done their best to meet the greatly increased demand to buy and sell properties. That's often involved working long hours on behalf of their clients to meet the March the 31st deadline that's been set for the stamp duty holiday. Madam Chair, I hope honourable members will briefly forgive me if I briefly revisit the rationale for introducing the holiday last spring. You will recall, Madam Chair, and colleagues will recall, the pandemic and then the resulting lockdown injected a very significant degree of uncertainty into the economy and into the housing market. In particular, during the peak of the first lockdown in April of last year, residential property transactions dropped by more than 50% compared to the month before. And of course, this was a very real source of concern, not just to those whose jobs and businesses rely on such transactions, but more widely because of their impact on the economy. Government's view was that when the country came out of lockdown, it should do what it could to give people the confidence to buy and sell their homes. And it was for that reason, at the summer economic update in July, that the Chancellor introduced what became known as a stamp duty land tax holiday. This raised the nil rate band, the threshold at which stamp duty land tax is due, from £125,000 to £500,000 until March the 31st of this year, saving the average buyer some £4,500 in tax. Now, it's important to say the measure was designed to drive the recovery of the housing market in England and Northern Ireland. That is, to stimulate immediate momentum in the property market and thereby to help to protect businesses and jobs in the sector by keeping house sales moving. The Welsh and the Scottish governments followed suit, although I note that both have decided not to extend the scheme. What is clear is that as a policy, it worked. The holiday is not the only aspect of the market that has driven sales, but it undoubtedly helped to incentivize people to move home. Residential property transactions have increased since the Chancellor announced the measure. In fact, transactions were up 34% in December, year on year. That in turn caused a positive ripple effect, with each transaction bringing a range of benefits, be those benefits to people whom home buyers hired to help them move, to the decorators they employed to repaint their new properties, or to the retailers from whom they bought furniture and appliances. It brought that wider rippling range of benefits. In other words, the aggregate effect helped to protect hundreds of thousands of jobs. Now, importantly, and I would draw the committee's attention to this, it was the time-limited aspect of the measure which drove that increased demand, which is exactly why the end date of March this year was announced when the policy itself was first introduced. Now, Madam Chair, I've already said that I absolutely understand people's frustration of colleagues regarding the forthcoming deadline on the stamp duty land tax holiday. But as honourable members well know, I cannot comment on tax policy outside a fiscal event. Let me, however, just pick up some of the points that have been made by colleagues in this debate. The member for Carshalton and Wallington, introducing the debate, made the important point that the focus should be on the holiday, and that was the cause of the petition, rather than on the wider policy itself, on which there is much further discussion that people have had, and I think he was right about that. The Honourable for Hornsey and Wood Green was right to focus on the extent to which a buoyant housing market was important for its knock-on effects. I agree with her about that, and I've highlighted them. The right honourable member for Hackney North pointed to the cyber attack that Hackney Council has felt, and she will be aware that I have written to her separately in relation to this very unusual and particular event. The member for Richmond Park, I think uniquely amongst the those who spoke, highlighted the tax costs of the policy and, as she said, flagged the considerable sums of money involved. And the member for Erith and Thamesmead, in responding to the opposition, focused on the effect of completion. I would remind her that the legislation includes not merely completion, but the idea of substantial performance, and that is itself is a legally recognised term. So, having said that, Madam Chair, let me conclude by thanking members for their contributions today on their own behalves and on behalf of their constituents, and thanking the thousands of people who signed the petition. The government will continue, as it always does, to listen carefully to representations from the industry and from those who are themselves planning to buy or sell a property.
Thank you, Minister. I now call Elliot to give us the winding up.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for responding, and to all members and right honourable members for their contributions to this debate. I think it's fair to say we've had a lot of views, although a rare moment of unity amongst three political parties in highlighting problems with the tax. I suspect we have very different ideas about how to reform stamp duty, but a rare moment of unity that we seem to agree that stamp duty land tax needs a longer term look at. But again, as I said in my opening statement, I appreciate that this might not be the moment in the middle of a pandemic that the Treasury wants to do that assessment. So I hope that the Minister has found our contributions useful today and will take back to the Treasury in advance of the budget those solutions that were offered by members in today's debate. I think the tapered winding down of this release seems to be the most popular view, but I know that the Minister will be listening very carefully to contributions from the industry as well in advance of that budget being made, particularly as we've heard, this isn't just about those moving house, it's about all the connected services and affected industries along the way as well. So can I thank everyone for taking part? I hope the petitioners found this this session useful as well, and can I thank Chair, you and the committee for allowing us to have this session in even virtual form to allow us to get it in before the deadline, so thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much for leading the debate, and thank you to everybody for attending today and for being so disciplined with your time. And my congratulations are added also to you, Greg, for the pending new addition to your family. Thank you very much to the broadcasters and to Hansard for accommodating this not quite in the normal run of things session. And thank you to the Labour front bench and to the Minister for responding to the concerns raised by members today and those of the petitioners who wanted this to be heard. Order, order.